The Huge Mistake of Japan. The Attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 6 a.m. The sun rises over the Pacific, casting molten gold across the still waters of Pearl Harbor. The air is warm, the sky perfectly clear. A postcard morning. On the decks of the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma, sailors stretch, laugh, and prepare for Sunday routine. Church bells ring faintly from Oahu shore. Engines hum softly. Flags flutter lazily in the tropical wind. Above Ford Island, seabirds glide in lazy circles, unaware that history is seconds from rupture. On the radar station at Opana Point, two young operators notice a strange cluster of dots, a formation of planes 60 miles north. They assume it's a squadron of American bombers returning from California. No alarm is raised. Out to sea, over 230 miles north of Oahu, 6 massive aircraft carriers slice through the waves under radio silence. On their decks, more than 300 aircraft are being armed. Torpedoes, armor-piercing bombs, fuel lines hissing, pilots strapping in. The calm of the Pacific is about to explode into fire, and with it, the Empire of Japan will make the greatest mistake in its history. The rising sun and the shadow of ambition. Long before the flames of Pearl Harbor lit the Pacific sky, the seeds of conflict had already been sown, decades earlier, in the ambitions of a rapidly changing Japan. In the late 19th century, the nation had transformed almost overnight. For centuries, Japan had remained isolated, bound by the Tokugawa shogunate's rigid code and closed borders. But the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships in 1853 shattered that seclusion. Under pressure from Western powers, Japan opened its ports, and in doing so, began an irreversible metamorphosis. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked the birth of modern Japan, a nation desperate not to be dominated, but to dominate. Feudal lords became industrial leaders. Samurai traded swords for rifles. Railways and shipyards rose where rice paddies once stood. Within just 50 years, Japan had achieved what took Western nations centuries: a modern army, a powerful navy, and a burning desire to be seen as equal among empires. The wars that followed were proof of its transformation. In 1895, Japan crushed Qing China in the First Sino-Japanese War, seizing Taiwan and Korea's influence. 10 years later, it stunned the world again, defeating Imperial Russia in 1905 at Tsushima. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had humbled a European empire. The world took notice, and Japan took pride. But pride breeds hunger. The early 20th century brought both prosperity and peril. Japan's population surged, industry boomed, yet its islands lacked vital resources: oil, coal, iron ore, and rubber. The empire could manufacture ships and planes, but not feed its machines without foreign imports. Its leaders faced a question that would define the century: expand or perish. By the 1920s, Japan's politics had tilted toward militarism. The army and navy held immense sway in government decisions. The spirit of Bushido, the ancient warrior code, was reborn in modern form: loyalty to the emperor, death before dishonor, sacrifice for the nation. A powerful myth began to take root, that Japan had a divine destiny to lead Asia, freeing it from Western domination. The slogan was seductive: Asia for the Asians. But in practice, it meant Asia under Japan's control. The Great Depression of 1929 hit Japan hard. Factories slowed, unemployment rose, and extremist voices grew louder. Nationalists blamed Western powers, especially the United States, for closing markets and stifling Japan's growth. And within this tension, the military took action. In 1931, Japanese officers staged the Mukden Incident, a false flag operation in Manchuria, then a Chinese province rich in coal and iron. Claiming Chinese sabotage, they invaded and swiftly occupied the region. The civilian government in Tokyo protested, but the army ignored them. Within months, Japan had established the puppet state of Manchukuo, installing the last Qing emperor, Puyi, as a figurehead. The League of Nations condemned the act. Japan simply withdrew from the League. The world's outrage meant nothing. Japan had discovered it could act and get away with it. This marked the true beginning of Japan's path to Pearl Harbor. Throughout the 1930s, Japan expanded deeper into China. In 1937, the invasion became total, the Second Sino-Japanese War. Cities like Shanghai and Nanjing fell under brutal assault. The rape of Nanjing, one of the darkest chapters in modern warfare, left over 200,000 civilians dead, entire neighborhoods destroyed. Western journalists who witnessed it sent horror across the globe. But inside Japan, the reports were censored. Citizens were told only of victory, of divine triumphs blessed by the emperor. Meanwhile, in Washington, alarm bells were ringing. The United States had long been Japan's primary supplier of oil, steel, and aviation fuel. American companies sold the lifeblood that powered Japan's navy and factories. Yet each Japanese advance into China tightened the moral and political strain. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration faced a dilemma: restrain Japan and risk war, or ignore its aggression and appear weak in the Pacific. By 1939, war had broken out in Europe. Hitler's Germany invaded Poland, and the world was plunged into chaos once again. Japan watched carefully and saw opportunity. If Europe was consumed by war, the colonial powers in Asia, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, would be vulnerable. Their colonies, rich in oil and rubber, lay within Japan's reach, but Japan's leaders knew the United States stood in the way. The American Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, was the ultimate deterrent, a symbol of Western power in Asia. And though America was not yet in the war, its presence loomed over every Japanese decision. In 1940, Japan made its fateful alignment. It signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, forming the Axis powers. The pact declared that if any one of them were attacked by a nation not already involved in the European war, namely the United States, the others would come to its aid. To many in Tokyo, this alliance seemed to guarantee Japan's dominance in Asia. To others, especially in the Imperial Navy, it was a gamble that could doom them all. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, saw the danger clearly. A brilliant strategist and Harvard-educated officer, he had studied the United States deeply. He understood its industrial might, its vast resources, and its willpower once provoked. Privately, Yamamoto warned his superiors, "In the first 6 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory, but I have no expectation of success in a long war." His warning went largely unheeded. Within Japan's military circles, hawks like General Hideki Tojo insisted that hesitation was weakness. The empire's survival, they argued, demanded expansion into the Dutch East Indies, into Malaya, and inevitably into conflict with America. Then came 1941, the year everything began to unravel. By mid-year, Japan had occupied French Indochina, cutting deep into Southeast Asia's colonial territories. Washington responded with escalating sanctions. First, the United States froze Japanese assets. Then, on July 26, 1941, came the decisive blow, the oil embargo. Almost overnight, Japan lost access to more than 80% of its oil supply. Its Navy, Air Force, and industry were left counting the months before their fuel reserves ran dry. Without oil, the empire would suffocate. Desperation turned into determination. Tokyo's high command concluded that only one path remained: seize the oil-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya before their reserves dwindled, and strike preemptively to prevent America from interfering. But how could they ensure the U.S. Pacific Fleet stayed out of their way? That question would shape the coming catastrophe. Japan's expansion was no longer a matter of choice. It was survival. And across the Pacific, the United States watched, hoping diplomacy might still prevail. But the distance between hope and war was closing fast. The road to infamy. By the autumn of 1941, Japan was trapped between pride and panic. Its armies had conquered vast territories from northern China to French Indochina. Yet behind the illusion of power lay a harsh truth. The empire was running out of fuel. Every week, the oil tanks in Yokosuka and Kure sank lower. Every ship that trained burned fuel that could never be replaced. The oil embargo imposed by the United States was slowly strangling Japan's war machine. Tokyo's leaders convened in endless meetings, searching for a way out. Could diplomacy still work? Prince Konoe Fumimaro, the civilian prime minister, believed so. He urged negotiations with Washington, appealing for compromise, a partial withdrawal from China perhaps, or a temporary understanding. But the military, led by General Hideki Tojo and Admiral Osami Nagano, refused to yield. They saw concessions as humiliation and humiliation as death. To them, retreat meant the loss of national honor and the emperor's divine mission. In these tense months, Japan's government was divided between two camps: the doves, who sought peace through diplomacy, and the hawks, who demanded decisive action. The doves whispered of reason. The hawks shouted of destiny. By October 1941, the shouting won. Prime Minister Konoe resigned, defeated by the army's pressure. In his place rose General Hideki Tojo, a hardline nationalist with a stern face and a soldier's discipline. His appointment signaled to the DI world that Japan's course was set, not toward peace but toward war. Still, even Tojo hesitated before plunging the nation into darkness. He knew that war with the United States would be total. In a cabinet meeting held in early November, he asked his ministers, "Can Japan fight against the United States and Britain? Are we truly prepared?" The silence that followed was telling. They were not prepared, not for a long war. But pride demanded defiance. And in the background, a man of intellect and conscience wrestled with an impossible duty: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was no fanatic. He had spent years studying in the United States, at Harvard University, then serving as naval attaché in Washington. He admired America's industrial strength, its creativity, even its people. But as a servant of the emperor, he had no choice but to plan for the unthinkable. If war could not be avoided, Yamamoto argued, then Japan must strike first, and strike decisively. He proposed an audacious plan: a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Destroy the fleet, he reasoned, and Japan could secure 6 months to a year of uncontested conquest across Asia and the Pacific. By the time America recovered, Japan's empire would be unassailable. Many of his peers dismissed the plan as madness. The Imperial Navy's traditionalists favored a more defensive strategy, waiting for the U.S. fleet to cross the Pacific, then ambushing it near the home islands in a decisive battle. But Yamamoto understood modern warfare. The age of battleships, he believed, was giving way to the age of aircraft carriers. Air power, not armor, would decide the future of naval war. His plan, Operation Z, called for a carrier task force to sail undetected across the North Pacific, launch hundreds of aircraft at dawn, and cripple America's fleet before it could fight back. It was bold, precise, and deeply risky. If discovered en route, the entire force could be annihilated. If unsuccessful, Japan would face an enraged giant with all its resources intact. Still, Yamamoto persisted. In November 1941, he presented the plan to the Naval General Staff. There was hesitation, but in the end the logic of desperation prevailed. Japan's oil reserves would last barely 18 months. Time itself had become the enemy. On November 5th, Emperor Hirohito approved the plan in principle. Japan would continue diplomatic talks with the United States. But if they failed by early December, war would begin. As Tokyo prepared for the final gamble, Washington remained hopeful but wary. The U.S. government, aware of rising tension, intercepted Japanese diplomatic cables through a secret cryptographic program known as MAGIC. American intelligence could read many of Japan's secret messages. Yet without full context, their meaning was fragmented, often misunderstood. One decoded telegram spoke of a deadline for negotiations, December 7th. But no one imagined that deadline meant attack. Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu met repeatedly with U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull in Washington. The talks were polite but fruitless. Hull demanded Japan withdraw from China. Japan refused. Hull offered to lift the oil embargo if Japan renounced aggression. Tokyo's military council saw this as surrender. Two cultures, two moral universes, spoke past each other. And behind those diplomatic smiles, Japan's carriers were already preparing to sail. On November 26, 1941, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo received the coded order, climb Mount Nitaka. It was the signal to begin the operation. That same day, the Japanese First Air Fleet, Kido-butai, slipped from Hitokapu Bay in the remote Kuril Islands. The fleet consisted of 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, escorted by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and oilers. Under absolute radio silence, they sailed east into the cold, empty expanse of the North Pacific. Not a single transmission betrayed their course. The entire armada vanished into the winter mist. At home, Emperor Hirohito waited. Though his image was divine, his influence was bounded by his generals. In private, he expressed unease, even fear. On December 1st, during a final imperial conference, he addressed his ministers, "If we are to go to war, we must bear the unbearable." The room fell silent. No one dared oppose the divine voice. War was now inevitable. In Washington, intelligence, analysts noticed troubling signs. Reports of Japanese ships lost from their usual routes, radio frequencies gone quiet. But no one connected the dots. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, received vague warnings of possible hostile actions somewhere in the Pacific, but not when and not where. In Hawaii, routine continued. The battleship stood proudly at anchor. Aircraft lined up wingtip to wingtip on airfields to prevent sabotage. Ironically, that very precaution would make them easier targets. Meanwhile, the Japanese strike force advanced across the gray waters, braving bitter winds and high seas. On board the carriers, pilots studied photographs of Pearl Harbor, memorizing targets: the Arizona, California, Nevada, Oklahoma, and West Virginia. Their mission was drilled into them with ritual precision. First, destroy aircraft on the EA. Ground second, strike the battleships third, prevent any counterattack. They were told the element of surprise would ensure victory. Many believed the Americans would surrender quickly, just as the Russians had in 1905. Few realized the scale of what they were about to unleash. Far across the Pacific, in Washington, President Roosevelt struggled to interpret Japan's intentions. His advisors presented conflicting views. Some believed Tokyo's moves were bluff. Others warned of imminent war. Yet even Roosevelt, a man of immense foresight, could not imagine Pearl Harbor as the target. The Philippines, Guam, or perhaps British Malaya, these seemed far more likely. Hawaii was too distant, too fortified, too sacred in its perceived safety. The days ticked down toward catastrophe. On December 6, 1941, Roosevelt received a partial translation of a Japanese message, the final part of a 14-point memorandum prepared for delivery the next day. Its tone was ominous, accusing the United States of hostile intent. As he read it, Roosevelt reportedly murmured, "This means war." But still, no order of alert reached Hawaii. That night, the Japanese fleet reached its launch point, about 230 miles north of Oahu. The sea was calm, the sky moonless. Aboard the Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leader of the first wave, delivered his final briefing to the pilots. His voice was steady. "The fate of the Empire rests on this mission. May fortune favor us." At dawn, they would rise into the sky and carve their names into history. But in that quiet hour before takeoff, as engines slept and waves lapped against steel hulls, even the most devoted warriors felt the weight of what was coming. Fuchida later recalled that the men were not shouting or celebrating. They were silent, many writing final letters to their families. The fleet continued on, unseen, unheard. In Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay still in the early light of December 7th. The radar at Opana Point picked up an approaching formation, but the warning was dismissed. At 7:02 a.m., Lieutenant Kermit Tyler told the operators, "Don't worry about it." He believed it was a flight of American B-17s arriving from the mainland. Minutes later, the Japanese planes would break over Oahu's northern horizon. Blueprint of a disaster, The attack on Pearl Harbor was not the product of chance or emotion. It was the culmination of planning so meticulous that even its enemies would later marvel at its precision. Japan, a nation with limited natural resources but boundless discipline, turned strategy into an art form, and war into a science. The tactical angle: strike first, strike hard. In the final weeks of 1941, deep within the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the architects of Operation Z refined every detail of the strike. Admiral Yamamoto had one overriding goal: to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet so completely that Japan could dominate Asia without interference. The operation was designed like a clock, each gear, each second, perfectly synchronized. The task force, Kido Butai, was the most powerful carrier strike group the world had ever seen. 6 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers. Commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, it represented the heart of Japan's naval might. Yet its power depended not on ships, but on planes, over 350 aircraft, ready to deliver the blow. The attack was divided into 2 waves. The first would destroy the airfields and the battleships anchored in the harbor. The second would target what remained: ships still afloat, repair facilities, and any resistance. The entire strike would last less than 2 hours. Timing was everything. Fuchida Mitsuo, the air commander, calculated that if the planes launched at 6 a.m. from their carriers 230 miles north of Oahu, they would reach Pearl Harbor just after 7:45 a.m., when most Americans were at breakfast or morning prayer. The timing would ensure maximum surprise and minimum defense. The attack route was equally deliberate. Rather than approaching from the west, where radar coverage was strongest, the planes would come from the north, a direction considered safe. The element of surprise was the single thread on which the entire plan hung. Each pilot carried a detailed target map: the berths of each battleship, the runways at Wheeler and Hickam Fields, the hangars at Kaneohe Bay. The precision was astonishing for its time. Japan had achieved this through months of intelligence gathering, including the analysis of American magazines, naval registries, and even tourist photographs. Every detail mattered, and yet beneath this flawless planning there was uncertainty. Nagumo, the task force commander, was cautious by nature. He had never commanded carrier operations before. His preference was traditional battleship engagements, not aerial warfare. He knew Yamamoto's plan was risky. It relied entirely on surprise. If detected early, the Japanese fleet could be annihilated in open water. But Yamamoto had made it clear: retreat was not an option. Failure was unthinkable. To ensure secrecy, Nagumo's ships maintained strict radio silence. No lights, no transmissions, no signals. Even weather reports were banned. The fleet relied on scouting planes for guidance, braving storms and freezing winds in the northern Pacific. The gamble was enormous, but so was the ambition, the technological angle, innovation in the shallows. The brilliance of Pearl Harbor's plan lay not only in its courage but in its technology, innovations born of necessity. One problem haunted the planners from the start. Pearl Harbor was shallow. Its depth averaged only 40 feet, too shallow for standard torpedoes, which required deeper water to arm properly. Without modification, Japan's most powerful weapon would be useless. Engineers and pilots at the Naval Air Arsenal at Kure devised a radical solution. They attached wooden fins, stabilizers, to the rear of the torpedoes, allowing them to glide across the surface without plunging too deep. When tested in Kagoshima Bay, the design worked flawlessly. These shallow-water torpedoes became one of the most effective innovations in the history of aerial warfare. Equally vital were the aircraft themselves. Japan's Mitsubishi A6M0 was the finest carrier-based fighter of its time, fast, agile, and deadly. With a range of over 1,500 miles and unmatched maneuverability, it could outfight anything the Allies had in 1941. The Zero's pilots were among the most disciplined and battle-hardened in the world. Veterans of the war in China, supporting them were Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, the deadly workhorses of the attack. Together, these aircraft formed a triad of precision. The Kates would deliver torpedoes and bombs against ships. The Vals would dive on airfields and anti-air batteries. The Zeros would sweep the skies clear of any defenders. Even, the bombs were custom-built. Japan converted 16-inch naval shells into armor-piercing bombs, capable of penetrating battleship decks. Each weapon was engineered for one purpose: maximum destruction in the shortest time possible. Training was relentless. At secret airfields near Kagoshima and Kyushu, pilots practiced low-altitude torpedo runs against mock targets resembling U.S. ships. Every maneuver was rehearsed, from formation flight to timing of release. Failure was punished harshly. Success was glorified. By late November, the strike force was ready. There was also a psychological weapon: the belief in divine destiny. Japanese military culture taught that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. This belief gave the pilots a confidence that bordered on fatalism. They were told that even if they perished, their sacrifice would secure Japan's glory for 1,000 years. But Japan's faith in its own perfection also carried danger. The nation's leaders underestimated the United States, its unity, its resources, its ability to adapt. Technological superiority meant little against a nation capable of producing 10 times as much steel, oil, and aircraft. Yet in 1941, Japan's success in Asia blinded it to that reality. Victory seemed inevitable. The rising sun, it was believed, would never set. The leadership angle. Men of iron and doubt. Behind every weapon and plan were men, complex, conflicted, and human. Each played a part in the tragedy that was about to unfold. At the top stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the intellectual architect of the strike. Elegant, disciplined, and quietly melancholic, Yamamoto was a man of paradox. He loved America's jazz music, admired its spirit, and dreaded war with it. Yet he was duty-bound to execute the emperor's will. In his heart he knew the truth: Japan could win battles but not the war. "If I am told to fight," he said, "I shall run wild for 6 months. After that I can guarantee nothing." Below him was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the strike fleet. Nagumo was cautious to a fault, a traditionalist uneasy with air warfare. He respected Yamamoto but doubted the plan's wisdom. Still, he obeyed orders. His role would soon become one of history's cruel ironies, leading the most successful surprise attack in modern history, only to question it hours later. Then came Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the fiery airman chosen to lead the attack itself. A skilled pilot and perfectionist, Fuchida embodied the spirit of the Imperial Navy: discipline, loyalty, and precision. He was aboard the flagship Akagi when the first wave lifted into the morning sky. It would be Fuchida who would radio the most famous words of the Pacific War: "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tiger, Tiger, Tiger," the code for complete surprise. Below them, hundreds of men, pilots, mechanics, navigators, performed their roles without hesitation. Each one believed his action was part of something larger, something eternal. Few had any hatred for Americans. To most, the coming battle was not personal, it was duty. And on the opposite side of the Pacific, leadership looked very different. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt balanced global crisis and domestic isolationism. He had frozen Japan's assets and enforced the oil embargo, but he also sought to avoid war, at least until America was ready. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and General Walter Short commanded the fleet and the island's defenses. Both were competent officers, but they faced impossible circumstances, vague warnings, limited intelligence, and a military culture that had never experienced an attack on its own soil. They prepared for sabotage, not invasion. Their ships were clustered together for protection, their aircraft parked in neat rows. And across the ocean, Japan watched, waiting for the moment to strike. Every piece was now in place. The strategy was flawless. The technology worked. The men were ready. But beneath this perfection lay fatal assumptions: that the United States would be shocked into surrender, that a single decisive blow could end a war before it began. History would prove those assumptions catastrophically wrong. As dawn approached on December 7th, the rising sun crested the Pacific horizon. The greatest gamble in Japan's history was seconds from beginning: the human angle, fear, fire, and the unthinkable. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the illusion of invincibility vanished. The sailors on board the USS Arizona had no time to react. A single 1 760-pound bomb pierced its forward magazine. In a blinding flash, the ship erupted, a fireball visible for miles. Within 9 minutes, she sank, taking 177 men with her. The explosion was so violent that nearby crews were momentarily deafened, the air filled with searing oil and screams. On the USS West Virginia, chaos reigned. Men dove overboard into flaming water, others fought to free trapped comrades below deck, hacking through twisted steel with bare hands. The harbor, once calm and clear, became an inferno of burning oil and human courage. Nurses rushed to the naval hospital, some in nightgowns, covered in ash and blood. The smell of cordite mixed with salt air, the horizon blotted by black columns of smoke. By noon, more than 2,400 Americans were dead, sailors, soldiers, nurses, civilians. Over 1,000 were wounded. For Japan, it was hailed as victory. In Tokyo, radio broadcasts cheered. Admiral Yamamoto, however, did not celebrate. He sat alone in his cabin, staring at a map of the Pacific, whispering words history would remember. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. He knew, instinctively, that Japan's short-term triumph might ignite its long-term ruin. The enemy's angle, the rising sun's gamble from the Japanese perspective. The Pearl Harbor strike was not born of malice but desperation. For years, Japan's military leadership believed their survival depended on domination of the Pacific. Western powers had cut off vital resources, oil, steel, and rubber, crippling Japan's ability to sustain war in China. By late 1941, the country had only enough fuel for 18 months of combat. The logic was simple but deadly. Strike now or be strangled slowly. Admiral Yamamoto, despite his Harvard education and respect for the U.S., was pressured by the Army's extremists. They believed a crippling surprise attack could force Washington to negotiate peace, to leave the Pacific under Japanese control. But Yamamoto's calculation, though brilliant tactically, was fatally flawed strategically. He knew America's industrial power. He had seen its factories, its steel mills, its shipyards capable of producing 10 times what Japan could. His fleet might destroy the U.S. Pacific presence temporarily, but it could never destroy America's capacity to fight. The technological angle, precision, innovation, and illusion Japan's torpedo bombers at Pearl Harbor were a marvel of wartime engineering. The Type 91 aerial torpedo, specially modified for shallow waters, could run at just 12 meters depth, a feat previously thought impossible. Engineers had added wooden fins to prevent it from plunging too deep upon release. This innovation turned a geographical obstacle into a weapon advantage. The Americans had believed Pearl Harbor was too shallow for torpedo attacks, a belief that lulled them into complacency. The Zero fighter, Mitsubishi A6M, symbolized Japan's mastery of aerial design, light, maneuverable, and deadly. It outclassed most Allied aircraft early in the war. Yet that same lightness came with a fatal cost: no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. When American fighters later learned to exploit these weaknesses, the Zero's advantage vanished almost overnight. What began as technological superiority soon turned into illusion, the illusion of permanence in a war of adaptation. The moral angle, the thin line. Between strategy and atrocity in war, morality often collapses under the weight of necessity. The Japanese viewed their strike as preemptive self-defense. The Americans saw it as treachery. The attack came without a formal declaration of war. Though a message had been sent to Washington, it arrived hours too late. Diplomats were still decoding it as bombs fell on Honolulu. The world was stunned. President Roosevelt that very evening drafted his now immortal words, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The moral cost was irreversible. In one morning, Japan transformed the United States from an isolationist power into a nation united by vengeance. The sleeping giant was not only awake, it was enraged. The psychological angle, the myth of invincibility. For both nations, Pearl Harbor rewired perception. Japan believed it had struck the decisive blow that would break America's will. But in reality, it accomplished the opposite. Within hours, Americans who had been divided by politics, geography, and indifference were united under one banner. Enlistment offices overflowed. Factories shifted to war production overnight. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, though bloodied, was not broken. Its aircraft carriers, the real backbone of naval power, were at sea during the attack and survived untouched. For Japan, the victory was deceptive, a psychological mirage. They had won a battle but lost the future. The flames over Pearl Harbor cast not only light upon destruction, they illuminated the beginning of Japan's greatest strategic downfall. From that smoldering harbor, the next stage of history began, the turning point that would reshape the entire Pacific War. December 8, 1941. The sleeping giant awakens in Washington. Dawn breaks over a nation changed forever. At 12:30 p.m., President Franklin D. Roosevelt enters the Capitol. His face, normally composed, carries the weight of disbelief and fury. As he approaches the podium, the chamber falls silent. Every camera, every pencil, every breath waits. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. The words pierce through history. They echo beyond the walls of Congress, across cities and towns, into the hearts of millions. The next day, both houses vote almost unanimously for war. The sleeping giant has risen, not in panic, but in purpose. Factories roar to life. Automobile plants begin producing tanks. Shipyards work day and night. Women fill the roles once dominated by men, riveting, welding, assembling bombers. The industrial heart of America becomes a war engine unmatched in human history. Across the Pacific in Tokyo, Japan celebrates. Newspapers print headlines of victory. The Imperial General Headquarters announces complete success. But beneath the jubilation, Admiral Yamamoto's fears deepen. He knows America's response will not be measured in words. It will come in steel, fire, and resolve. January 1942. The expansion Japan moves swiftly. In less than 3 months, it conquers the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The empire stretches from Burma to the Solomon Islands, the largest territorial expansion in Japanese history. To the world, it seems unstoppable. The rising sun flag flies over more than 100 million new subjects, but every victory is costly. Supply lines stretch thin, fuel stocks dwindle, and American submarines begin to strike back, silently, relentlessly. The U.S., humiliated but not defeated, reorganizes its Pacific Command. Admiral Chester Nimitz assumes control of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He studies every map of the Pacific, every radio intercept, every Japanese movement. He knows the enemy's strength lies in offense. Its weakness lies in overreach. The turning tide, intelligence and counter-move unknown to Japan, American cryptanalysts begin cracking the JN-25 naval code, the backbone of Japanese communications. In a small, nondescript building at Pearl Harbor, intelligence officers piece together fragments of messages, ship movements, convoy schedules, target designations. By April 1942, they intercept a message referring to a mysterious target, AF. The analysts suspect it's Midway, a tiny atoll northwest of Hawaii. To confirm, they send a fake radio message from Midway reporting a water shortage. Days later, Japanese transmissions confirm AF is short of water. The code is broken. The trap is set. But before Midway, America seeks to strike back symbolically. April 18, 1942. The Doolittle Raid 16 B-25 bombers, stripped of unnecessary weight, launch from the deck of the USS Hornet, something never before attempted. Their target, Tokyo. It is a daring mission led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. The planes have just enough fuel to reach Japan and continue westward, hopefully landing in China. When the bombers roar over Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe, Japanese civilians are stunned. The damage is minor, but the psychological effect is seismic. For the first time, the Japanese homeland has been touched by war. Yamamoto's pride is shaken. The attack exposes Japan's vulnerability, its assumption of invulnerability shattered. He vows to crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet once and for all. His new plan will lure the Americans into a decisive confrontation, a battle he believes will end the war in Japan's favor. That battle will be fought at Midway, May 1942. The setup Japan's plan is intricate. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, will attack Midway Island, drawing out the remaining U.S. carriers for destruction. A secondary fleet will invade the island itself, but what Japan doesn't know is that the Americans are already waiting. Admiral Nimitz positions his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, hidden in the vast Pacific expanse. His pilots, though fewer and less experienced, have one decisive advantage: information. June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway. Begins at dawn. Japanese aircraft launch their first wave against Midway. American Marine defenders scramble into the air. The island burns, but the core of the U.S. defense remains intact. Meanwhile, Nimitz's carriers close in. From the sky, the U.S. torpedo squadrons strike first and are slaughtered. Torpedo after torpedo misses, and nearly every American plane is shot down. But their sacrifice pulls the Japanese fighter cover, the deadly Zeros, down to sea level. Moments later, at 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers arrive, unopposed. In 5 blistering minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu are engulfed in flames. Their decks erupt, fuel ignites, bombs detonate. By afternoon, Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier, is found and destroyed. 4 Japanese carriers, the same that struck Pearl Harbor, lie burning in the Pacific. The Empire's tide has turned. From the smoke of Midway, a new balance emerges. Japan's offensive momentum is broken, forever, but its leadership refuses to surrender. The war will now descend into a fight for survival, island by island, mile by mile. June-August 1942. The illusion shatters after Midway. The Imperial Japanese Navy reels from a loss it can scarcely comprehend. 4 of its finest carriers, the pride of the Kido Butai, are gone. More than 300 elite pilots, irreplaceable veterans of Pearl Harbor and the early Pacific campaigns, are dead. Tokyo broadcasts claim tactical victory, but the truth cannot be hidden. Behind closed doors, senior officers whisper the unthinkable. Japan has lost its offensive power. Admiral Yamamoto withdraws to regroup, but he knows the truth. Japan's expansion has reached its limit. The Empire now faces a battle it never prepared for, a war of attrition, a war Japan cannot win. August 1942, Guadalcanal. The war turns savage. The first U.S. counteroffensive comes sooner than Japan expects. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines land on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Chain. Their objective? Seize a half-built Japanese airfield, later named Henderson Field, and deny Japan control of vital sea routes. For 6 brutal months, the island becomes a cauldron of mud, disease, and death. Every inch of jungle becomes contested ground. American and Japanese soldiers fight hand-to-hand, often in darkness, often with bayonets when ammunition runs dry. The Japanese army, still bound by the code of Bushido, refuses to retreat. But starvation, malaria, and U.S. naval gunfire slowly grind them down. By February 1943, the remnants of the Japanese garrison are evacuated under cover of night. Guadalcanal marks the first major land defeat for Imperial Japan. It is the moment when the myth of Japanese invincibility dies, not with fanfare, but with exhaustion and silence. 1944. The iron flood, America's war machine, now moves at full throttle. By 1943, the United States produces more aircraft, ships, and tanks than all Axis powers combined. New Essex-class carriers roll off assembly lines faster than Japan can sink them. Thousands of young American pilots train relentlessly, learning from Midway, mastering new tactics, and flying aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat, built to outfight and outlast the Japanese Zero. Meanwhile, the submarine campaign intensifies. U.S. submarines, once plagued by faulty torpedoes, now strike with deadly precision. By 1944, they have sunk more than half of Japan's merchant fleet, strangling the Empire's supply of oil and raw materials. In the skies, Boeing's B-29 Superfortress takes flight, a technological marvel capable of carrying tons of bombs thousands of miles. The air war shifts from the Pacific Islands to Japan's very doorstep. October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Empire makes one final gamble. Admiral Toyota orders a massive counterattack to repel U.S. forces landing in the Philippines. The plan, Shogo, is audacious but desperate. Use decoy fleets to lure American carriers away while surface battleships crush the landing force. The result is Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. Over 200,000 sailors and 280 ships clash across 4 separate engagements. Japanese pilots, realizing their fuel reserves and numbers are beyond recovery, begin launching kamikaze attacks, deliberate suicide missions aimed at U.S. ships. It is both horrifying and symbolic, the ultimate expression of sacrifice, and the final proof of strategic despair. Though the kamikazes inflict terrible damage, they cannot reverse Japan's fate. By the battle's end, Japan loses 4 more carriers, 3 battleships, and most of its remaining naval air power. The Imperial Navy, once feared across the Pacific, ceases to exist as a coherent fighting force. 45. The fire descends by early 1945. Japan's skies burn nightly. U.S. bombers rain destruction upon Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The most devastating of all, and the Tokyo firebombing on March 9 to 10, 1945, kills over 100,000 civilians in a single night. The scale of the inferno dwarfs even the atomic bombings that will follow. Still, Japan refuses to surrender. Its leaders cling to the hope of negotiating peace, but only after inflicting enough casualties to force America's hand. That hope will vanish in August 1945. August 6 and 9, 1945, the final shock at 8:15 a.m. on August 6, the B-29 Enola Gay releases a single bomb over Hiroshima. A blinding flash turns the morning into white fire. In an instant, 70,000 lives vanish. The city burns for hours. 3 days later, Boxcar drops another bomb over Nagasaki. The devastation is equally unimaginable. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addresses the Japanese people for the first time in history. His voice, trembling yet resolute, declares surrender. The words are simple. We must endure the unendurable. The empire that once dreamed of Pacific dominion ends in silence and ash. The great mistake revealed. Looking back across those 4 years, from the blazing skies over Pearl Harbor to the ruins of Hiroshima, the scale of Japan's miscalculation becomes clear. What was meant to secure survival only guaranteed destruction. By attacking Pearl Harbor, Japan forced the one nation capable of total industrial war into action and united an enemy that could not be intimidated. The attack that was supposed to paralyze America instead immortalized its will. From the burning decks of Akagi to the smoldering streets of Tokyo, one truth emerges from the ashes. Japan's greatest victory had been its greatest mistake. The world after the inferno. The guns fall silent, but the silence feels heavier than the noise ever did. In August 1945, as the mushroom clouds fade from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the full scope of the war's devastation begins to take shape. Japan, once a rising imperial power, lies in ruins. 66 major cities have been bombed. Millions are homeless. Famine and disease stalk the survivors. The empire that once stretched across East Asia is gone, replaced by ruins, graves, and ghosts. From the palace in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito's broadcast echoes across a stunned nation. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come. For many Japanese citizens, it is the first time they have ever heard his voice. Some weep, others stare blankly, unable to process defeat after years of propaganda promising eternal victory. Across the Pacific, the United States celebrates, but quietly. There are parades, yes, and relief, but for those who fought, the cost of victory is measured not in glory, but in graves. More than 400,000 Americans have died. Millions more return home wounded in body or spirit. And yet, for the world, a new era has begun, one defined by atomic fire and political realignment, occupation and reconstruction, the American hand in Japan on September 2, 1945. Aboard the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Empire of Japan sign the instrument of surrender. Standing before them is General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. As the ceremony concludes, MacArthur speaks with solemn restraint. It is my earnest hope that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge. For the next 7 years, Japan is under American occupation. But instead of vengeance, the United States opts for reconstruction. Factories are rebuilt. Land reforms are introduced. The old militarist order is dismantled. The Japanese Constitution is rewritten. Democracy replaces dictatorship. Article 9 renounces war as a means of national policy. The Imperial Army and Navy, once symbols of conquest, are disbanded. This transformation is not immediate nor easy. Millions of soldiers return from the front to shattered homes. Entire families search for missing relatives in cities reduced to ash. Yet in the midst of despair, something remarkable begins. Rebirth. The human cost. A nation of the lost every corner of Japan bears scars. From Okinawa to Tokyo, survivors, hibakusha, live with radiation sickness, disfigurement, and the psychological trauma of atomic war. Children orphaned by the bombings wander among ruins, clutching fragments of family photographs. The once proud Imperial Navy is now a fleet of sunken relics scattered across the Pacific floor. The unsinkable aircraft carriers of the Japanese islands themselves become occupied territory. In Hiroshima, a lone structure remains standing near the bomb's hypocenter, the Genbaku Dome. It becomes a symbol not of defeat, but of memory, of warning. Japan's leaders face trials in Tokyo, mirroring those held at Nuremberg. General Hideki Tojo, the architect of war, is found guilty and executed. Others receive life sentences. The judgment is not just on individuals. It is on an ideology, the belief that conquest is destiny. America's rise, the new superpower while Japan rebuilds, the United States emerges as the undisputed leader of the free world. Its industrial power, untouched by invasion, now dominates the global economy. Its navy rules the oceans. Its air force commands the skies. The same factories that produce tanks and bombers now produce cars, radios, and the machinery of prosperity. The atomic bomb, once a weapon of last resort, becomes the foundation of deterrence, the beginning of the nuclear age. But beneath the victory lies an unease. The memory of Pearl Harbor remains raw, a permanent wound on the national psyche. It becomes both lesson and legend, a warning never to be caught unprepared again. In Washington, the phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," becomes policy. It shapes military doctrine, intelligence operations, and foreign strategy for decades to come. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Cold War to the present, the shadow of that December morning lingers. Japan's transformation, from empire to economy. By the early 1950s, Japan's miracle begins. Under American guidance and Japanese resilience, the nation reinvents itself not through conquest, but through craftsmanship and innovation. Electronics, automobiles, and industry replace battleships and bombers. The cities rise again. Tokyo gleams with neon. Osaka hums with industry. Hiroshima becomes a city of peace. The sons of soldiers now build cars, not tanks. Circuits, not rifles. And yet, even in the prosperity of the post-war decades, the ghosts of 1941 remain. In schools, in memorials, in documentaries, the story of Pearl Harbor is told and retold, not as a tale of pride, but as a warning of hubris. The first chapter of the aftermath closes with paradox. A nation defeated by war becomes reborn through peace. A country that sought to dominate the Pacific becomes one of the world's leading democracies. And the weapon that ended its empire ensures it will never wage war again. But beyond Japan and America, the consequences of Pearl Harbor ripple across continents, shaping the Cold War, colonial independence movements, and the new global order. The global shockwave when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, it did more than ignite war with the United States. It altered the balance of the entire world. In December 1941, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had seemed unstoppable. Hitler controlled most of Europe. Mussolini's fascist Italy ruled the Mediterranean. Japan's empire dominated Asia and the Pacific, but with America's entry into the war, the global equation changed overnight. Industrial power became military might. The Allies now possessed resources, manpower, and technology on a scale the Axis could not match. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles began feeding not only American forces but also Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. The arsenal of democracy had come alive. What Japan thought would be a short, decisive war became an unwinnable global conflict, a fight against an opponent whose potential it had catastrophically underestimated. The collapse of the Axis Pearl Harbor triggered a chain reaction. 4 days after the attack on December 11, 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States, a decision as reckless as Japan's own. In doing so, he turned the world's largest industrial power into his enemy. The consequences were immediate and monumental. American troops soon landed in North Africa, then in Italy, then on the beaches of Normandy. While Japan fought to hold its Pacific Empire, Germany and Italy crumbled under the weight of Allied power. By May 1945, Berlin lay in ruins. Hitler was dead. Nazi Germany had surrendered. 3 months later, Japan followed. The Axis alliance that had once vowed to dominate the world vanished in less than 4 years. The new order, the United States and the Soviet Union, out of the ashes of the Second World War, 2 powers emerged supreme: the United States and the Soviet Union. The old empires, Britain, France, the Netherlands, were exhausted. Their colonies restive, their treasuries empty. For America, Pearl Harbor became more than a memory. It was a mission statement. Never again would the United States retreat into isolation. From now on, it would stand as guardian, and sometimes enforcer, of global order. For the Soviet Union, victory in Europe brought vast influence but also tension. Within months of Japan's surrender, a new rivalry emerged: capitalism versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship. The Cold War began not in Europe, but in the vacuum left by World War II, a vacuum created by the chain of events that started on that December morning in Hawaii. Asia's transformation. From empire to independence, Japan's fall also shattered the colonial structure of Asia. British, Dutch, and French empires, weakened by years of occupation, found their authority challenged by nationalist movements that had learned from Japan's example. In Indonesia, Vietnam, and India, leaders invoked the rhetoric of self-determination. The end of Japan's empire became the beginning of Asia's decolonization. Ironically, the very war Japan began to dominate Asia ultimately liberated it, just not in the way Tokyo intended. Where once the rising sun had claimed to free Asia from Western imperialism, it instead unleashed forces that would make imperialism itself obsolete. Memory and reckoning, Japan's inner. War in the decades following surrender, Japan embarked on an internal journey that was as profound as its physical reconstruction. Schools taught the tragedy of Hiroshima, the lessons of Pearl Harbor, and the dangers of blind militarism. Memorials rose not to glorify conquest, but to honor loss, a rare humility in the history of war. The Yasukuni Shrine controversy, where the souls of Japan's war dead, including convicted war criminals, are enshrined, revealed the complexity of national memory. For some, it symbolized patriotism, for others, unhealed guilt. Japan's post-war identity became built upon peace, restraint, and progress. Its military, renamed the Self-Defense Forces, existed only to protect, not to invade. Its constitution forbade aggression, yet its technology, diplomacy, and economic strength gave it a new kind of power: influence through creation, not destruction. America's transformation, the keeper of vigilance for the United States, Pearl Harbor became both trauma and catalyst. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" was engraved into the nation's consciousness, a moral compass reminding future generations of the cost of complacency. Every major war and strategic decision since Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, even modern defense policy carries echoes of that attack. The lesson is permanent. Vigilance is not optional, but with victory came responsibility and burden. In becoming a global superpower, America inherited the weight of global expectation. The Pacific, once distant and unknown to most Americans, became a central stage for its diplomacy, economy, and security for generations to come. Technology, warfare, and the birth of the atomic age Pearl Harbor also reshaped how humanity conceived of war itself. Before 1941, war was fought with ships, tanks, and planes. By 1945, it was fought with atoms. The technological race ignited by World War II would define the rest of the 20th century. Jet propulsion replaced propellers. Radar became the unseen eye of modern combat. Nuclear energy transformed both warfare and science. Every major technological leap of the post-war era, from satellites to computers, traces its lineage to the crucible of innovation that Pearl Harbor inadvertently accelerated. What Japan began with torpedoes ended with quantum physics. The moral reckoning. The cost of ambition historians have long debated whether Japan could have avoided war in 1941. Some argue that diplomacy had already failed, that embargoes and pressure left no path but aggression. Others insist that arrogance and the belief in divine destiny and superiority sealed Japan's fate. But the truth, stripped of ideology, is simpler. In chasing empire, Japan mistook fear for respect and silence for submission. It believed that by striking first, it could secure peace on its own terms. Instead, it awakened an enemy that embodied the very forces Japan had underestimated: industrial power, democratic unity, and moral outrage. The lesson, carved into the ruins of Hiroshima and the wrecks at Pearl Harbor, is universal. No nation, however mighty, can build peace through surprise and domination. The story of Pearl Harbor ends not in Hawaii, nor even in Tokyo, but in the modern world it created, a world forever cautious, technologically transformed, and bound by the memory of one morning's fire. And from that memory rises the quiet reflection: what the world learned, and what it must never forget. The echo of a single morning on December 7, 1941, the world changed in less than 2 hours. More than 80 years later, the sound of that morning still travels across generations, not as an echo of vengeance, but as a warning carved in steel and memory. The Japanese pilots who once flew through the clouds above Oahu were young, disciplined, and utterly convinced of their cause. The American sailors who died below, many never knowing who struck them, were equally young, equally devoted. They were two faces of the same human paradox: courage bound to ideology, loyalty bound to orders. History has preserved their clash not only as a tale of war, but as a mirror of human ambition. What happens when nations pursue destiny without restraint, when pride overrides reason? The fragile balance between power and perception. Japan's leaders had believed they were cornered, that only through a devastating first strike could they preserve their empire. But what they misread, and what Pearl Harbor revealed, is that perception can be more powerful than bullets. In attempting to frighten America into negotiation, they forged American unity instead. The very act meant to paralyze the United States awakened its might. History would repeat that irony many times afterward, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, whenever a strike meant to weaken resolve instead forged it stronger. The lesson remains timeless. A single misjudgment of character, or of will, can turn an empire's ambition into its downfall. From fire to forgiveness decades after the war, former enemies would stand together at Pearl Harbor: presidents, prime ministers, veterans who once aimed at one another. They spoke not of revenge, but of remembrance. In 2016, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited Pearl Harbor alongside U.S. President Barack Obama. Abe offered words that symbolized generations of reflection. We must never repeat the horrors of war. We must never allow our children to experience such pain. No treaties or reparations could achieve what that moment did: acknowledgement, empathy, and peace built on mutual understanding. The harbor that once burned now hosted wreaths, silence, and the shared conviction that remembrance is humanity's final duty. The evolution of warfare and the weight of memory. Pearl Harbor marked the twilight of one era and the birth of another. Before that day, war had been about territory and armies. After it, war became about technology, intelligence, and total mobilization. The attack demonstrated that no ocean, no distance, could guarantee safety. In the nuclear age that followed, that realization became the foundation of deterrence, that wars are no longer won by striking first, but by ensuring no one dares to strike at all. Yet beneath the machinery of geopolitics lies the human truth, that the value of peace is understood most clearly by those who have seen it destroyed. The psychological victory and the human cost. Japan's leaders achieved what they sought on that morning: shock, destruction, humiliation of a great power. But their triumph lasted hours, while their nation's suffering lasted years. When the fires in Pearl Harbor died, the fires of Tokyo and Hiroshima had yet to come. By 1945, Japan lay in ashes, its cities erased, its people starving, its emperor stripped of divinity. The empire that sought immortality vanished, leaving behind a humbled nation that rebuilt itself not through conquest, but through creation. That is perhaps the most profound transformation in modern history, A nation reborn from defeat, choosing peace as its weapon, progress as its armor. The power of restraint in studying Pearl Harbor. Historians often ask what might have happened if Japan had waited, negotiated, or chosen another path. But the true lesson may not lie in what was done, but in what was not restrained. Human progress is not defined by our ability to wage war, but by our willingness to prevent it. Restraint, moral, political, strategic, is the rarest form of strength. In 1941, restraint collapsed. In its absence, the Pacific burned. Today, in a world armed with weapons far beyond the imagination of that era, restraint is no longer a virtue. It is survival itself. Legacy beyond war. From the wreckage of Pearl Harbor rose two legacies, one forged in power, the American century, the other forged in humility, Japan's pacifist rebirth. Together, they became proof that even the deepest wounds can evolve into partnership, that yesterday's enemies can become allies shaping the future of peace, science, and diplomacy. The United States rebuilt Japan not as a rival, but as a partner. From ashes rose cities like Tokyo and Osaka, symbols of what human resolve can achieve once freed from the chains of vengeance. The Pacific, once divided by fear, became a bridge of cooperation. The eternal vigil today. The wreck of the USS Arizona still lies beneath the waters of Pearl Harbor. Oil still seeps slowly from its hull. The black tears, as sailors call them, rising like tiny reminders that history never truly sleeps. Above it, visitors stand in silence, watching the ripples move across the surface. Some weep, others simply listen. And if you listen long enough, you can almost hear the whispers of that morning. Engines roaring, alarms blaring, voices shouting for help. Time has softened the noise, but not the meaning. It speaks still, to every generation that believes peace is guaranteed, to every leader tempted by the illusion of quick victory. What the world learned. The mistake Japan made at Pearl Harbor was not one of courage, but of understanding. It believed strength alone could define destiny. It believed destruction could force respect. But the truest power lies not in the strike, but in the wisdom to avoid it. Pearl Harbor taught humanity that wars begin with fear and pride, and end with ruin and regret. It reminded the world that civilization's greatest victories are those that end before the first shot is fired. Final reflection. When the sun rises over Oahu each December 7th, its light still glints across the calm Pacific, the same water that once burned with smoke and oil. The world it illuminates now is shaped by the choices, mistakes, and lessons of that day. Pearl Harbor was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point, one that redirected the course of nations and forced humanity to confront the consequences of ambition unchecked. The silence that now hangs over those waters is not emptiness. It is remembrance, a testament that peace once lost must be guarded forever, for in the end every empire falls, every weapon rusts, and what remains are the stories of those who died, of those who learned, and of a world forever changed by the morning Japan made its greatest mistake. Reflection. The legend that rose from the ashes in the vast chronology of World War II, the battles, the leaders, the rising empires and crumbling regimes. There are moments that transcend the pages of history. They do not just describe what happened. They define why humanity made the choices it did. The attack on Pearl Harbor was one such moment. It was not merely the beginning of America's war. It was the end of illusion. It ended the belief that oceans could provide safety. It ended the idea that the United States could observe war from afar. And in that crucible of fire, a new force emerged, one that would ultimately reshape the fate of the modern world. But Pearl Harbor was not just a lesson in vulnerability. It was a testament to resilience. Ships burned, men died. The harbor itself seemed swallowed by smoke and flame. Yet from that very fire rose something stronger than steel, a national resolve that could not be sunk. And among the flames, one ship's story would come to symbolize this transformation more than any other. USS Helena. More than a warship, USS Helena was not the largest ship in the fleet. She did not carry the might of a battleship nor the prestige of a carrier. But she possessed something rarer, a fighting spirit matched only by the men who served aboard her. She had been struck at Pearl Harbor, bleeding oil into the harbor as she fought back with such fury that the Japanese believed they were under attack from a battleship. They called her the machine gun cruiser, not out of admiration but fear. In every engagement that followed from Guadalcanal to Kula Gulf, Helena would fight with the same relentless defiance. She would take damage that should have doomed her. She would suffer casualties that should have broken her. And yet, like America itself, she refused to yield. Helena was not just a ship. She was a mirror, a reflection of a nation that had been struck but not defeated, wounded but not broken. The human legacy years after the war, survivors of the USS Helena would speak not of glory nor heroism, but of duty. They remembered the sound of the guns, the shudder of the hull, the faces of shipmates who never returned. They remembered Pearl Harbor, not as the day everything ended, but as the moment everything began for them. And for the United States Navy, the war was not about revenge. It was about proving that tyranny, no matter how sudden its strike or how devastating its first blow, could not extinguish the will of a free people. The lesson history will never forget. In the end, Japan's attack did not break the United States. It awakened it. The Pacific would burn. Battles would rage from island to island. Thousands of lives would be lost, but every battle, every sacrifice, every turning of the tide could be traced back to a single moment in time, December 7, 1941, when the course of history was violently, irrevocably altered. Pearl Harbor did not signal the beginning of the end for America. It signaled the birth of a superpower, and out of that birth, forged in fire, sailed the USS Helena, the ship they called Machine Gun, the ship that would not die. The ship whose story would be remembered for generations as a symbol of resistance, rebirth, and ultimate victory. This is not merely the end of a story. It is the beginning of America's transformation into the arsenal of democracy, and the moment when fate itself began to turn against the Axis. History did not remember Helena because she survived. History remembered her because she fought on, even when survival was no longer possible.